The British have long been entranced by Italy. Its beautiful countryside, the enduring traditions of art and culture, and of course, its extraordinary gardens. I'm taking a journey throughout the whole of Italy, visiting beautiful gardens everywhere I go. You come in and immediately you feel inspired. I'll be in Florence, where gardens grew from the Renaissance ideals. In every direction, you see balance, order, and harmony. And Naples, with unexpectedly intimate glimpses behind displays of astonishing grandeur. This is a peek at her bum, and I like the sense of what the butler saw. I'll be looking in on the gardens of the rich and the famous. So what's this one here?
Mr. Clooney's place?
Yeah, I can see why you might want to live there. As well as meeting local Italians growing some of the best food in the world. Very good. But my journey begins in Rome, the seat of emperors and popes, to visit gardens that are amongst the most flamboyant ever created in history. Tourists have been flocking to Rome for hundreds of years to feast on the astonishing architectural richness of its classical past. But many also come to see its great gardens, most of which originate from a brief but golden age of garden making. In a 50-year period from about 1550, there was suddenly an explosion of garden making. Extraordinary, magnificent gardens. And you have to wonder, why then? Why round here, Rome? And also, why gardens? To find out, I'm going to visit the most spectacular of the gardens from this period in and around Rome. As well as getting to know these iconic gardens, I'll also be exploring the lives and the turbulent times of the enormously powerful and wealthy men that made them. Now, the greatest wealth and power in 16th century Italy was not in the hands of bankers or kings, but of the church. The most powerful group of people in Rome of the 16th century were the cardinals, and they all had their eyes fixed on just one seat of power. And that was the papacy. The Pope was the most influential man in the Christian world. Every living soul in 16th century Europe was either fiercely for or against him. He had the greatest art collection in the world, the greatest power, and access to vast wealth. This intoxicating combination was the prize that every aspiring cardinal greedily desired. You have to picture Rome round about the middle of the 16th century as a place that was asserting itself. And they were saying, we are the powerful people. This is God's city. And right here in the Vatican, the single most powerful place on the planet, God's representative ruling it. And that gave the cardinals and the people working around the Vatican an extraordinary sense of power and brashness and confidence. And that's the context in which you have to set these gardens that they were making. When a pope died, the cardinals elected one of their numbers to succeed him. However, in the 16th century, this was less a measure of their spiritual qualities and more a result of how influential, rich, and cultured they were. And one way to demonstrate these attributes was by making an awe-inspiring garden. I'm heading off an hour north to Villa Farnese in Caprarola, which is a small town in the province of Viterbo, about 40 miles from the center of Rome, to visit one of these great gardens made by a power-hungry cardinal. I've come to Villa Farnese mainly because I've always wanted to see it. But the reason why people have come here in such great numbers is because it is generally reckoned to be one of the most perfect examples of a surviving Renaissance garden. This was the home of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese II, of the distinguished Farnese family, whose grandfather was Pope Paul III. Pope Paul had originally commissioned the building as a fortified castle at a time when Rome was almost constantly at war. But by the time the cardinal inherited it in 1549, all that had been built of this fortress were the five-sided footings. So in 1556, Farnese hired the architect Giacomo Vignola to build an enormous palace on these existing foundations and to create the latest fashionable accessory, a beautiful Renaissance garden. There's no doubt that we have this idea that Italian gardens are all formality, clipped hedges, green, at best, very mannered, calm, stately type of garden, but at worst rather bleak, even hard and harsh compared to our love of flowers. And I think that's one of the things I want to know, is what were they like? How have they evolved? And is what we're seeing now a true picture of Italian gardens as they've developed through history? By the 1560s, when this garden was made, the Renaissance had been in full swing for over 100 years and had produced an unprecedented flowering of new ideas in art, architecture, literature, science, and philosophy, from artists such as Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo. But this wasn't just about paintings and sculpture. The Renaissance also launched the idea that a garden could be a work of art. To find out more about this garden in particular, and Renaissance gardens in general, I meet Giorgio Galletti, a garden historian who's restored a number of Renaissance gardens like Villa Farnese. The ideas of order and symmetry and harmony were key parts of Renaissance thought, weren't they?
Vignola used pure geometry, and also he designed this garden on pure geometry according to a square grid. Architecture, not only garden, should be based on pure geometry. The idea of the man should recreate the harmony of the universe. And it has to be very simple and very feasible to be understood by man.
Right. This grid-like formality might appear constraining to modern British gardeners, but it was designed to create order out of chaos, placing man in controlled and controlling harmony with nature. As you climb steep steps to the top of the garden, you leave the ordered formality behind and enter the Bosco, which was a wood designed for the cardinal and his guests to indulge in his greatest pleasure, hunting prey ranging from wild boar to songbirds. It's best to think of the garden as a process or a journey. So you've gone from the ordered gardens down by the villa, then up through the Bosco, this place of excitement, of hunting, of wild animals, and nature in sort of red in tooth and claw, but controlled. And then, as you come through the end of the Bosco, there's a clearing. And in front of you is this apparition. It's a fairy palace. It's an extraordinarily rich creation rising up out the ground. And you've reached this state of absolute beauty. This is where Alessandro Farnese entertained his fellow cardinals and anyone, and in truth that was everyone, that he wished to impress. It is an astonishing ethereal fantasy. It is built from stone, water, vast riches, and an even greater ambition. The water features and sculpted cascades pointedly demonstrate his cultured sophistication. And at every turn, you can see clear symbols celebrating the greatness of the Farnese dynasty. All this fun and games was really part of power play. The most important thing that this is saying is, I am a powerful man. Think of this water being channeled down in this marvelous staircase of water made by dolphins. Well, any visitor would have known the dolphin was the crest of the Farnese family. Now, Alessandro's grandfather had been Pope. He'd tasted it. He'd been close to the seat of power. So he had about him this sense of right. And the garden expresses that. The river gods, the water coming from their cornucopias going to a glass. This is the fountain of the glass. The idea of taking rivers and then drinking them, holding them in your hand. This wouldn't have gone unnoticed. So the symbolism is almost as important as the aesthetic beauty. Despite all the jostling for position that went on between cardinals, it was a very small world that they moved in, and many would dine and hunt together as friends. So when Farnese created this garden, fully 10 years after the lower gardens were completed, he turned to a fellow cardinal who himself had made a great garden nearby for some advice. This Palazzina, rather grand building up here at the top, was recommended to Farnese by his neighbour, Cardinal Gambara, at Villalanti, who fundamentally said, look, old chap, you've got gout. Like me, you find it a bit tricky when you're having your dinners outside on a summer's evening. Build yourself a shed at the end of the garden. So he did. Very nice shed it is too. And it was up here that they would relax. The power play would be done, and there would be wine and song, if not women. This garden is formed from an elaborate parterre of crisp box hedging, superb sculptures, and the delightful play of water. However, there is a notable absence of flowers of any kind. Yet according to Giorgio Galletti, Renaissance gardens like Farnese would originally have been filled with colour.
There was a kind of symbolic flower garden, particularly a lot of lemon pots. When there was the fashion of the bulbs, all the cardinals and princes, they were in competition to buy the rarest bulb.
Right. And if you talk to most people in England now, they will say, but there are no flowers. It's all just evergreens and shapes. And it's very beautiful, but limited. So what you're saying is that was never the case?
Not in the Renaissance. There were jasmines, crocuses, lilies. That was very important for the Farnese family because it was in their coat of arms, and pots of small topiary in box.
So what happened to all the flowers? Villa Farnese became abandoned and overgrown when garden fashions changed, and it wasn't restored until the 20th century. In many gardens like Farnese, the only planting to survive was the box hedging, which in fact was often not original. So restorers assumed that Renaissance gardens were flowerless. It is quite a shock when you realise that the image of the Renaissance garden is actually inaccurate. It wasn't like that. And that they wouldn't have used box, and it wouldn't have been green, and they would have had flowers. And when I came to this top section, I stood here for a bit thinking, well, I don't get it. I just don't feel any response to this rather flat open space and the green grass. And it wasn't until I learned that actually it wasn't like this. It was full of flowers. It was like a physic garden with beds, with beautiful specimens that they were gathering and were being given as presents. When you think about it, why shouldn't Renaissance gardeners have enjoyed flowers every bit as much as we did? And I need to undo these preconceptions I have of Italian gardens as being all about shape and structure and form, and start to fill in the gaps with flowers and the pleasure of flowers, just like I have in my own garden. Alessandro died in 1589, just a few years after the Palazzina was completed. But his garden remained hugely influential, particularly to his fellow cardinals, vying to outdo each other with the magnificence of their gardens. The great outpouring of art and culture in the Renaissance, with its emphasis on harmony and order, was in part a reaction to centuries of chaos. Throughout the whole medieval period, Italy was a patchwork of warring states, and it had also been particularly devastated by the Black Death, wiping out a third of its population. So by the beginning of the 15th century, the Renaissance was inspired by looking back to the glories of ancient Rome, which until then had been almost completely ignored. So I am now heading 15 miles east of Rome to an archaeological site that had an enormous influence on the great 16th century burst of garden making. This is Villa Adriana, which was built almost 2,000 years ago by the Western world's most powerful man, the Emperor Hadrian. The reason I've come to Hadrian's Villa is not so much to admire the garden, because that hasn't survived 2,000 years. This hasn't been quietly growing for all that period, it's all recreated. But there is enough evidence, enough of the layout, to provide the spark that lit the fire for Renaissance gardens. And although you can go to Renaissance gardens and you can enjoy it, you don't need to know everything about it, it's just lovely. If you want to know the story and to understand it, you have to pick up the threads starting here in Hadrian's Villa. Hadrian built his villa in the early decades of the 2nd century AD, at the same time as his famous wall was being built across the border between England and Scotland. This was the emperor's palace, his court, and the military headquarters for Rome's vast empire. Hadrian travelled more widely than any other emperor, and his gardens were directly inspired by ancient Greek and Egyptian architecture and mythology. For hundreds and hundreds of years, the ruins just lay there. They were ignored, and people didn't pay them any mind. And it wasn't until the beginning of the Renaissance that people began reading the literature and looking at the ruins, putting two and two together, and realizing there was something special here. And gradually, the columns and the statues and the water features began to be potential that they could use in their own gardens and their own houses. And if you think about it, we still take it for granted that there are columns and statues and temples in grand gardens. But none of that existed before the Renaissance rediscovered the classical world. The part of this enormous, sprawling site that most excited Renaissance visitors was the Canopus, which was a long colonnaded pool with statues all the way around, culminating in a large banqueting hall with a great arched and domed opening. I've arranged to meet Marina de Franceschini here, an archaeologist who's been studying the villa for the last 20 years, to find out just why the Canopus was so important for Renaissance artists and architects.
I feel like dwarf because if I think that here all the greatest architects of all times have come, Palladio, Pilo Ligorio, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and everybody else, so but everybody was coming here to take inspiration, and also because they were looking for measurements. They were looking for the magic formula that would give them the perfect proportion of buildings. And also they were trying to understand the secret of building a place like this that is still standing after so many centuries, 1,000 years of neglect.
The visiting 16th century architects came here not just to admire the aesthetics of the building, but to rediscover practical engineering knowledge that had been lost since the fall of the Roman Empire. One vital lost skill was how to transport vast quantities of water. Hadrian used a 10-mile-long aqueduct just to supply the villa's countless pools and fountains. And the sheer volume of water needed for pools designed to cool and reflect light into buildings was a clear demonstration of the emperor's knowledge and power.
You must imagine the water was flowing down
here?
down there,
Yeah.
and then was flowing in this channel, in the middle water, in this inner channel.
So water playing, water moving and overflowing and...
Water was a way to show the power of the emperor, because we know that there was an aqueduct bringing water from the Aniene River.
But the water was part of the garden in the sense it wasn't
Sure.
a practical purpose, it was for decorating.
Yeah.
And where did they eat? How did that happen?
So
did they
they
have
were
it?
lying here
On
on
this?
this.
So you lie on top of here?
Yeah, you must imagine that there were cushions,
So cushions-
pillows.
You see, you do it elegantly.
Yeah, and then there were the servants bringing food,
But there was-
bringing drinks. And also, I believe that over there was a place for the emperor, because that was the best place. Imagine Hadrian, what kind of nice garden parties was having here. Really something exceptional.
In the lake, in the water itself, would they have had sort of boats or anything like that?
There were small boats with people having feasts and orgies, but mainly the beauty of the lake was the reflection of the landscape. You must imagine also a dinner party in the evening with candle lights, with this sound, music, dancers. It was really something beautiful to see and something impressive.
No, I'm impressed, definitely. Now, round the back of these seating areas is a doorway. And the public aren't allowed in here, but they've let me in because it leads to the emperor's private quarters. And presumably there were guards in here. Now, this is where Hadrian would have his dinner. So all his guests reclining down below. Remember, these are just a selected few, but he was on his own up here. And there was water in a pool here. And in the alcoves, you've got gods, you've got statues. Now, you have to imagine this lined with marble. So light spangling off the walls, white marble, and this godlike emperor bathed in a halo of light. And it would have been really powerful stuff. So that the garden, the emperor, delicious food and song and entertainment and light, water, all coming together. And you can see if you take that leap of imagination and then apply it to the Renaissance and these powerful cardinals, they want some of that magic. They want Hadrian's magic, best of all. "1,400 years later, one man set out to recapture the emperor's magic with his garden, or even to outreach it. The setting for this is just a mile up the hill from Hadrian's Villa, in the small town of Tivoli. The garden I'm about to visit was made by the most powerful, the most ambitious, and the richest of all that pack of powerful cardinals that were milling around the papacy. And he was given the governorship of Tivoli as a reward, but it was a double-edged sword because it kept him out of Rome. And he poured his wealth and his ambition and, to some extent, his frustration into his garden. This man was Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, and his garden harnessed water and made it dance and perform like no other, before or since. I've been to Villa d'Este a few times before. You come in here from the top, but actually originally it was designed to arrive at the bottom of the garden. And then the visitor would slowly climb up this hill, amazed at all the wonders they were seeing and thoroughly puffed by the time they reached the top. And that's how it was originally designed, so that it would unfold and reveal itself. And by the time you reached the top, which is where the cardinal would have been, you were in a state of breathless awe. Cardinal d'Este had vast wealth and an overwhelming desire to become pope. When he failed in his first attempt in 1549, he hired Rome's most distinguished architect, Piero Ligorio, to create the biggest and most ambitious water garden since Hadrian's Villa. Ligorio demolished whole streets to make room for the garden on the steep hillside and built a sophisticated system to bring water from a nearby aqueduct. In today's money, all this would cost a cool £100 million. But this wasn't just a matter of d'Este displaying his wealth and artistic taste, although it was certainly that. He also intended to impress visitors with the depth of his scientific knowledge, and these were truly astonishing feats of hydroengineering.
The scale of the water is just ridiculous, really. Miles over the top. But what d'Este did was rechannel the water supply in the town. It took a third of the town's water supply to make his garden. So having done that, then he was determined to do something big with it. So you have this enormous hydrotechnical display. And it still remains the most impressive I've ever seen. And it all comes from one source, and there's no pumps at all. The whole thing is powered by pressure. So they knew what they were up
to. By studying Villa Adriana, Renaissance architects rediscovered ways of taming water that had been lost for 1,000 years. They found they could control the water's speed and movement using different sized pipes and spouts. And with this new knowledge, the artistic ambition of gardens rose to new and astonishing creative heights. This is the terrace of 100 fountains. It took 5 years to make. It uses water that comes from a single source, no pump. All the fountains have the same velocity, the same rhythm, the same sound, and it builds up as you walk along. It's like a musical instrument. Now, poor old Cardinal d'Este, he hardly saw this. It took 5 years at the end of his life and then was completed. And behind this beauty is a nagging pain for him, because the 3 layers of water represent rivers leading to Rome. And of course, that's where d'Este wasn't, and that's where d'Este most of all wanted to be. In the 2 decades it took to construct his garden, Cardinal d'Este made 5 failed bids for the papal throne. With every setback, his garden got grander and grander, and the coded messages it sent out became ever more pointed. The waters of the 100 fountains flow down here to a piece of the garden called the Rometta. And the story behind it is that the Pope forbade Cardinal d'Este to build a palace in Rome because he knew that he would challenge his power. So d'Este petulantly said, OK, if I can't have my palace in Rome, I'll have Rome in my palace. And so he's built a model of Rome. Rometta was originally more than twice its current size, but most of it was demolished in the 19th century. However, in the 16th century, d'Este's guests would have been able to see an elaborate model encompassing the whole of Rome, and thus the power of the papacy in his garden, with its own pantheon. and a Colosseum. And they certainly would have understood the message intended by this statue of Romulus and Remus, the founding fathers of Rome.
I think what this garden really displays, they didn't really go for meditative calm or obvious floral beauty in the way that we do. What they wanted were fun and games. They wanted drama, and apparently this was D'Este's favourite bit of the garden. And he used to put on theatrical performances here, and there were all sorts of things going on. There are fountains, there's allegory, there are people prancing about, dressed up, no doubt. The whole thing is busy with drama, and that's the way they liked it.
The simplicity, symmetry and harmony of early Renaissance gardens were being replaced by a new fashion for the dramatic. Gardens now engaged and entertained the visitor with spectacular and highly theatrical displays. And there was a new spirit of playfulness, with a constant intent to surprise and delight, typically with water jokes, designed to give you a good soaking when you were least expecting it.
This fountain, by the way, is meant to surprise you. It suddenly springs up, and I have actually been here before when it came even more playful, so it may happen any minute. But the whole point was to have jokes. Gardens were places to delight and surprise and amaze and entertain you. And if you've got money, then of course that entertainment can get very elaborate indeed. And this whole square can fill with water.
To the modern eye, D'Este's garden seems somewhat kitsch and garish. But this was a world where moneyed good taste ran easily from Palestrina masses and Michelangelo to musical water fountains.
There's a common perception that Cardinal d'Este built this garden out of anger and frustration because he couldn't be Pope. But I'm not sure that's right. I think that obviously he did want to be Pope, and he was very cross about it. But I think the really interesting thing is that he lived in an age when very powerful, very rich men expressed that power and that creative energy by building a garden. I mean, just as now an oligarch will buy himself a football team or a newspaper, it seems to be that it was acceptable to make a garden, and that would impress other rich men. And so what we have is a flowering where wealth and power expressed itself in gardens, and I can't think of another age when that was true.
Despite all his wealth and all his power, D'Este ran up huge debts creating his garden, and he never did become Pope. Back in the centre of Rome, the Borghese Gardens were originally built for the Borghese family in Renaissance towns, but are today managed by the state and are the city's most popular public space.
Gelato limone piccolo. Grazie. There are a few great public gardens in Rome, and my favourite are these, the ones at Villa Borghese. Come here on a Sunday, I'm losing my ice cream, or a bank holiday. They're packed, mainly with local people, using them, playing, enjoying, walking in these exquisite gardens.
It's just a lovely place to come and relax with the local Romans, and it's certainly worlds apart from the Rome of 500 years ago. The confidence and even arrogance displayed by the 16th century cardinals through their gardens superficially exudes a sense of invincibility. But in fact, it was a turbulent and uneasy period. Just a few years earlier, Rome had endured one of the worst traumas of its entire history at the hands of the Holy Roman Emperor, the Spanish King Charles V.
It's all too easy to build up this picture of high Renaissance Rome as this glorious place, untroubled, with great and grand men in control. But in fact, in 1527, there was the sack of Rome. And 30,000 troops of Charles V came in and pillaged and raped and destroyed the city. Beautiful gardens were lost, buildings burnt down. And that wasn't just a loss of material, it was a crisis of confidence. And all these great cardinals and leaders with their money and their power
knew that they could lose the whole thing at a stroke. Life was very tenuous. And the next garden I'm going to tells that very vividly and graphically, all in a relatively small garden, tucked away in woodland. The garden I'm about to see is unlike any other, and certainly completely different from the other great gardens of the age. To get to it, I'm heading back north again to a small hilltop town not far from Caprarola called Bomarzo. The town is dominated by a large palace belonging to the noble and ancient Orsini family. In 1552, one of the family created a Renaissance garden like no other. But it's separate from the palace, down in the valley below, hidden within a nearby wood. This is the Sacro Bosco, or sacred wood, and everything about it is completely different from the other great gardens of the period. Harmony and symmetry are replaced by twisting pathways. It is full of fantasies and visions that loom out of the trees. And for an age that believed absolutely in goblins, ghosts, and woodland sprites, they are spiced with real horror. If you think of the more conventional gardens, they're laid out, they're imposed on the landscape. Streets are moved, areas are flattened, water is brought in by aqueducts, in enormous effort to bring mankind to dominate it. But you can't help having a feeling here that they walked round, had a look at it, saw the trees, saw these enormous lumps of rock, and thought, oh, we could do something with that. And it is extraordinary when you think that these great lumps of stone like this were just there, and they hacked into it on the spot. The Sacro Bosco was created by Duke Vicino Orsini. The Orsini family had included 3 popes and dozens of cardinals, but Vicino Orsini was a man of action, a soldier and a poet, as well as being distinctly hard up. He married into the wealthy Farnese family, which did enable him to make the garden, but his resources remained limited. However, although his garden lacked in elaborate engineering or architecture, he loaded it with anarchic riddles and visual puns, which no one has ever fully deciphered. At the garden's heart is a giant mouth of hell. It's a reference to Dante's Inferno, but the inscription advises the visitor to abandon all thought rather than hope. There is this grotesque mouth with nostrils like cannons, and it's like a child going, grrr. And then when you go inside, it's rather charming. It's like a little picnic house. And you can imagine the Duke and his chums coming down here and having a bottle of wine and some cheese in this cool, rather elegant room. There is a building in the garden, a solid 2-story house, but it leans drunkenly into the hillside. It has been suggested that it symbolizes the collapsing fortunes of the House of Orsini. The house has been built at a slope. It's leaning. It's falling. And certainly the 16th century visitor would have appreciated the pun on house, household, family, the name, at a tilt. And of course, one of the ironies is that this falling, leaning house is still standing strong after 500 years. Try and stand up.
and I get the wobblies. It's really weird. What I absolutely love is the green, the way that you go from earth to stone to tree with this one green that goes up through. And then, you know, a sculpture comes along too, but wood and natural stone and ground and sculpture all become part of the same thing. And that's just lovely. Presumably it wasn't like that when it was made, of course. Again, it's where time changes the garden for the better.
It certainly would have originally looked very different because all these beautiful mossy and weather-worn sculptures would originally have been painted in bright, gaudy colours.
So look how lovely this is. It's a good gardening lesson. If you want moss, you want to have poor drainage, i.e. stone or bark, shade and water, and then it will flourish.
Orsini was a soldier of fortune, a mercenary, fighting for the Pope amongst others. So it's no surprise that one of his main themes is the abuse of power. Here, the colossal figure of Hercules takes his righteous, if disturbingly rapacious, revenge on Cacus, who has stolen his cattle. And one message comes through loud and clear in this garden, which is that Orsini is challenging the overweening confidence and pride displayed in the grand gardens of Rome's ruling class.
I think this garden, it's almost a revolt against the attempt to apply order that the Renaissance had done to gardens and life in general. This idea that if you make everything symmetrical, then somehow life will become controlled. And what Orsini's doing here, I think, is saying, well, life isn't like that. Life is uncontrollable and strange, and there's war and there's violence, and, you know, you can be married and you love your wife, but you can have lots of lovers, which he did. You can lust after other people. You can be a man of peace and of art, but go to war and kill people. And that if it's almost a stab at early psychology. And so he's built this place, which has some beauty, but then suddenly, looming out of the mist is a monster of the imagination. And I suspect that's a bit too fanciful, trying to interpret the whole thing in that way, but certainly that element seems to be here.
In the end, Bermazzo remains an enigma, and rightly so. It's a beautiful and disturbing tangle that would be diminished if it was unravelled. Bermazzo's eccentricity was a reaction against the pretension and pomp of the cardinals, and they were becoming political loose cannons, hell-bent on creating increasingly ostentatious gardens. I'm now heading 12 miles south of Rome to the town of Frascati. Its cooler climate made it a popular spot for the cardinals to escape Rome's burning heat and build their summer villas. And this, of course, meant making gardens. But there was a major problem: insufficient water. The fashion for ambitious water features, like those at Villa d'Este, were literally running Frascati dry. And the battle over water rights that followed was highly unchristian. We think of cardinals as being good men, holy men, but actually power corrupted them spectacularly throughout this period. And some of them were warlords, they were murderers, they were robbers. Every venial sin they could commit, they had a go at it. And in fact, they used to scupper each other's gardens by destroying the water supply. If you couldn't have water, you couldn't have a decent garden. In 1598, Pope Clement VIII gave his nephew, Cardinal Pietro Aldobrandini, this site, dominating the town in which to build himself a villa. And critically, he also provided the money, 50,000 scudi or £5 million at today's value, to fund a brand new aqueduct that gave the town a reliable water supply, but only after the garden had taken its fill. I arrive on hedge trimming day. The Italians are invariably expert when it comes to pruning trees. This 200-yard-long tunnelled avenue of holm oaks, whose exterior has been clipped to a monstrous hedge, is, I think, topiary at its finest.
From the outside, this looks like a solid block of hedge. And from the inside, these are great big trees. And I'm pretty sure they were planted as a hedge, and they've been allowed to grow out massively. I don't know, for 100 years or something, I suspect. And then have been clipped back. And so what you have is a halfway house. You've got great oak trees, and inside all the bones showing like the inside of a bleached whale. And then on the outside, this box front of foliage. And only time will bring this. Only time and neglect can make something as beautiful as this.
The heavy skies open, and the rain sends me on up to the shelter of the villa. This was given to Cardinal Aldobrandini as a reward for negotiating a peace treaty with France. It was an extremely generous gift, also a canny one, because popes aren't allowed to own property. So it was a way that Clement was able to keep it in the family. The peace treaty gave Rome control of the key town of Ferrara, along with a sizable chunk of the d'Este family fortune. These spoils allowed Aldobrandini to create a villa and a garden to outshine all those of his Frescati neighbours. The villa isn't usually open to the public, so it's a rare privilege to be allowed inside.
Inside the villa is a painting of Cardinal Aldobrandini. And there he is, a surprisingly young man, really. And apparently he was a man of great power and intellect and organizational skills. And this was all made for him.
By the time that Cardinal Aldobrandini came to build his villa, a new movement had replaced the Renaissance. This was the Baroque. Baroque was a style of architecture and garden design that was dramatic, elaborate, triumphant, and very confident, and was underpinned by the desire to reassert the supremacy of the Catholic Church over its Protestant enemies.
One of the interesting things when you look at gardens is that you obviously do your homework. You see photographs, you look at books, but nothing prepares you for the reality. And of course, the honest response is to be flabbergasted. Can't really think of anything sensible to say because just the scale of the thing.
Whilst at first glance the Water Theatre might seem to be decorated with a series of anonymous mythical characters from classical Rome, it is in fact a celebration of papal power and the Aldobrandini name. And the symbolism all of their contemporaries would have recognized immediately. So Atlas, bearing the world on his shoulders, represents Pope Clement. And at his feet, triumphantly rising out of the sea, is the heroic head of Hercules, symbolizing Cardinal Aldobrandini.
They love this idea of masque, which was one-off theatre, enormously expensive, put on as a performance to impress those in power. And this is what this is. It's gardening as grand display for a select few. And it's very symbolic that it's not open to the public. It's still just you and I looking at this and a handful of other people. And the performance is for us.
Above the water theatre, a cascade flows and bounces down steps to the balustrade below, with a tall pair of columns flanking it. It was designed so that it is wider at the top, and the foreshortening makes it appear steeper and more dramatic, especially when viewed from the villa. Pietro Aldobrandini and his guests would look across and applaud the water spiralling down the columns into the balustrades either side of the cascade, and then down into the theatre as a performance and spectacle as dramatic and entertaining as any opera.
The cascade as it stands is impressive. It's a roar of water coming down, but actually it's only half the action, because the two columns at the top have got spirals. And originally water came out the top, worked its way round, and they came splashing down and spilling into the pool below. So you had the central cascade, you had the spirals at the top whizzing around like firecrackers made out of water, and then the banisters coming over the edge. So the whole thing was wildly over the top, very kitsch, and probably really good fun. Oh, here we go. You see the channel that comes round is really quite big. So quite a lot of water would come down here, picking up speed as it went, throwing light onto the mosaic, and coming down to go down the balustrades. And the important thing is that you have that fantastic aspect of the villa, but they have a brilliant view of what's going on, particularly from the top, which was the viewing platform for the Cardinal and his friends. Because it wasn't just the theatre down below they wanted to see, but also this. Up here, on this level, is as much again, if not more.
The top of the garden has been derelict since the Second World War, when it was badly damaged by American bombers during the Allied invasion.
That's enchanting.
This is the only grand papal garden not owned by the state. It remains in private hands, still owned and still lived in by the Aldobrandini family. Looking after a garden and villa like this is clearly a mammoth undertaking. However, the current owner, Prince Camillo Aldobrandini, is embarking on the formidable job of restoration.
Well, as you see, there are some scaffoldings, and we are hoping to make a quite important work of restoration, especially for the fountains, which are in very, very bad state. It was bombed during the war. Yeah. My father restored it, but having used cement, it's now in a very bad state. Everything has to be repaired again.
And of course, the water is a huge issue, because it's still quite a big thing to have that water running, isn't it?
Yes. We have an aqueduct, actually, and the water then was used for this villa, and we sell the water to the villages around here.
So does the garden always have a good supply of water?
No, there are some moments in autumn when there is no water in the fountains. Yeah. We are now studying to put a recycling outfit so that the same water can be used over and over again.
And to what extent would you ever consider restoration to a particular date? Are you putting the garden back to the 16th century? Or?
I wouldn't. It would be a pity to cut down trees. In the Italian mentality, these countryside villas were usually a repetition of urban houses. And so they didn't want to have too many trees. Just wanted to have it a house and very low gardens and statues.
And presumably some things have been lost from this.
Yes, there were statues all over this balustrade, but and they were taken by Napoleon. Napoleon took all the statues and belongings of his brother-in-law and his brother-in-law's brother, which was my great-grandfather. And he said he would pay them after he would come back from Russia. Unfortunately, things didn't turn out as planned.
Not quite. It's a very good story.
At the garden's highest point is the main water supply, still flowing from the same aqueduct Cardinal Aldobrandini built 400 years ago.
The last cascade is the most natural, I think the most charming too. It's got real elegance. And of course that was the idea, that as you got away from the palace, everything became more natural and blended into the wild, but of course very, very controlled. This was wilderness absolutely under the thumb of man. In the 21st century, nature has taken over, places have been cleared, trees have grown, they've decayed. And because it's a private garden, it feels intimate. It feels that you're seeing something very personal. And I'm not sure I'd like this to be fully restored and made public and gleaming and a historical document. I think part of the magic is that it almost feels like it could disappear at any time. So it's more precious.
Villa Aldobrandini is still astonishingly grand, but age has given it an air of engaging scruffiness that I think makes it all the more charming. On my tour around these great gardens of Rome, I've seen gardens designed to entertain, and to shock, but above all, to impress. And how they succeeded, although not perhaps as they intended, as they continued to impress and influence gardeners and tourists for the next 400 years. And it remains an astonishing thought that they were all made within such a brief period of time.
During this 50-year period at the end of the 16th century, the cardinals were vying with each other for the papacy like dogs in a pack. And the gardens that they were making were not for a love of plants or horticulture as such. They were primarily to impress each other, to show their power in order that they could become the Pope themselves. And the irony is, of course, that none of these great garden makers ever made it to the top table. But what they left behind were not so much a piece of history showing how powerful they were, but a set of some of the most beautiful gardens the world has ever seen.
Next time, I'll be in Florence, where the creative revolution of the Renaissance not only changed art and architecture, but also transformed gardens of every kind.
Comedy with Rev at 11 o'clock here on BBC HD this evening. But coming up next, it's Friday night in EastEnders.